University of Texas. We're so proud not only to have the department represented this today in our Language Matters, but to have these three individuals doing a group presentation for us. So I'm going to introduce the group all together rather than do one after the other and interrupt the talk, so I'll introduce all three presenters. Our first presenter, Joshua Frank, is a PhD student in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese and a language instructor in the Spanish bilingual bicultural program. His previous and current research focuses primarily on advanced Spanish-English bilingual speakers. He's specifically interested in the role of cross-linguistic influence, age effects, and the input conditions in acquisition of Spanish and English WH question words. Jesse Adding, my mistake, is a PhD student in the Hispanic Linguistics program. He's currently working at the media project developer for the Department of Spanish and Portuguese's Media Center. His research focuses on linguistic variation, language acquisition, bilingual grammar, learner interaction, and heritage language learning. And finally, Dr. Lidia Huerta is a lecturer of Spanish at the University of Texas in Austin. Her areas of teaching focus on the teaching of Spanish for Spanish heritage learners, Spanish and Portuguese for professional purposes, translation, and the cultural aspects of international business. Her areas of research focus on violence, ethics, sex trafficking, and globalization through the analysis of Mexican and Spanish contemporary literature, film, and art. Today, the three of them will be doing a tag team with the topic of bilingualism, biculturalism in the Spanish foreign language classroom. It is my pleasure to introduce our panel of three speakers today. Welcome, them.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Garza, and it's a real honor to be presenting as part of the Language Matters series. And thank you so much, Bessie, for all of your work behind the scenes. She made a very beautiful slide for us, which was distributed. We're very grateful. Thank you all for coming out, and it's nice to see some familiar faces. So I'm Joshua Frank, graduate student in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese. I'll be beginning the talk by just referring to one of the tasks. We have three classroom tasks that we'll be presenting today, which have been highlighted in the classroom. So they all target different things from word orders to lexical variety and things of that nature. Our title for today is Bilingualism and Biculturalism in the Spanish foreign language classroom. Of course, by bilingualism and biculturalism, we're talking about, well, Jesse assured me that biculturalism is a word, so I feel much more confident about using that now. But we mean heritage language learners. So this is, as opposed to second language learners, we speak of heritage language learners, bilinguals. Even though, for example, I teach a 601, which is an introductory course, they are, in many instances, very much so bilingual, as well as bicultural. And of course, by foreign, I don't really mean foreign, do I? These heritage language learners have a background, linguistically and culturally, in Spanish. So that's a little bit misleading, and that's why I wanted to, I guess, bring it to the surface. So just a recap, very quickly, with a little introduction. One of our goals is to sort of bridge the gap between language acquisition theory in general, bilingual language acquisition theory as well, specifically, and then also take it to the classroom. So instruction, how can we bridge this gap? It's often rather large. So I'll brush on that very briefly, and hopefully we'll see how that extends to our interactive tasks. Then we'll have a little talk, a little demonstration on word order activities, which I will begin with interrogative inversion, and Jesse adverb placement, and we'll also talk a little bit about the for versus para dichotomy. And then Lydia will talk about, just she has a beautiful presentation on Spanish lexical varieties. It will be very entertaining. So just a brief introduction. This is a picture of the classroom. As I mentioned, we wanted to bridge the gap between bilingual language acquisition and theory, right? The theory, and then the bilingual classroom instruction. So one of the key words that we're going to be emphasizing today are individual differences. That's sort of, at least in bilingual acquisition theory and language acquisition theory in general, that's a real key word right now, real hot topic. Individual differences, not to focus on a comparison of means, collapsing everybody into one group, but looking within each group, whether it's a monolingual control group, bilingual, early bilinguals, late bilinguals, heritage language learners, late second language learners. We want to look within the group for individual differences. So that's one thing we're going to focus on. And we're going to find that the heritage language learner classroom is a beautiful resource for differences. Culturally, as Lydia will talk about, grammatically, as Jesse and I will talk about. So we want to really emphasize individual differences. So not that I can, in 1 minute, do a brief recap of the 25 years development of language acquisition theory, but I certainly will try to. So a real seminal article, or perhaps just a seminal article, from 1989 by Roman, begins to talk about this fundamental difference, this idea that a native speaker, or a monolingual, is characterized by uniform success. They learn the language. Again, this is not the idea of individual differences. This is just, you are a native speaker, thus you will acquire the language perfectly. And then second language learners, which can be extended to bilinguals, or let's say bilinguals that have interrupted development. Maybe they learned some as a child, heritage language learners, and come back to the classroom. Now they will be characterized, again, speaking in bilingual terms, be characterized by something a little bit less. They won't actually reach a native-like level. It's just, there'll be a large amount of individual variation. And that's, so even the idea of individual differences is seen in the 80s. But the emphasis is still on deficits. And then we have a wonderful article, and it's not just in 2003, but Lydia White was speaking of these issues long before. The idea of bilingual grammars and universal grammar in general. Why have a deficit perspective? It's just different. Bilingual grammars are different from monolingual grammars. Bilingual grammars are rule-based. They are restricted by UG. Why have a deficit perspective? So that was a shift in thought. And then more recently, work by Birdsong and Nebraska, as I touched on earlier, discuss why why should we compare means across groups? Or the control group, collapse all of them, have a mean, compared to a bilingual group, collapse them, have a mean. Maybe there's individual difference within each group. Maybe we need to analyze each individual in a more profound way. Maybe we'll find that native likeness is possible in some cases, and these cases aren't negligible. They're not exceptional. Maybe we're going to find that monolinguals aren't even behaving as theory says they should. Okay, in terms of group means, there are significant differences, but let's go to the level of the individual, and perhaps there's something more and open up a whole new world. So that's, I think, where we are now, and what we want to do is bring this to the classroom. How can we celebrate these bilingual grammars, these differences in culture as well, and in the lexicon, and how can we use that not only to celebrate it, but for the benefit of our students. So just a generic example, student 1 might say in our classroom, well, this sounds right to me, and then student 2 might say, well, no, I don't think so, I prefer to say it in a different way. Okay, certainly, what is the role of the teacher now? It could be teacher moment, for sure. We might ask student 1, why does it sound right? Or student 2, why does this sound right to you? We want them to think critically, want to develop their metalinguistic knowledge, and they verbalize it. Or perhaps both forms are correct, and it's just based on context, based on culture, dialectal variation. And so we want to bring all these out to the surface. So what we've tried to work on is how do we elicit this? How do we make this the center of conversation? So basically, just to sum everything up, our goal is developing a student's metalinguistic knowledge, fostering a general openness of acceptance of difference, and advancing general critical thinking skills. This is our goal. Okay. And then basically we are proposing that we trigger these points of divergence, whether they be lexical, grammatical, cultural, and then foster a discussion that this will push us in the right direction. And as we know, there is just ample material for this. Divergence within a classroom is individual variation is huge. Within each classroom, each semester, every class, we have to rewrite our class every semester because it's just completely different. And this also connects back to the theory, back to language acquisition. Where does the theory say things diverge? Where are bilingual grammars different from monolingual grammars? And so, again, we're trying to bridge this gap. Okay, so I'm going to provide a brief lesson here, then get out of the way, because these guys have really dynamic, incredible presentations. So I'm looking at a word order variation, and specifically subject-verb inversion in WH questions. So here we have matrix and embedded examples provided in English, the Spanish and the English. So in 1A, ¿con quién volvieron Julia y Marco a Texas? Which literally means with whom did Julia and Mark return to Texas? So if we just notice this, the superficial differences, right? We have a dummy do insertion here. We have a subject lexical verb inversion in Spanish, not case. In English, it's the dummy do that inserts. Lexical verb stays in its, emerges in its initial position. We can think about it in terms of a generative canon. We think of Kazetsky, Trego, 2001, and just the idea of the features that motivate this and the strength of each phrase. And then in embedded context, we see a much similar typology, actually. Right? We don't have this dummy do insertion, then the inversion of the non-lexical or the lexical. We just have everything fairly similar with one exception. Inversion, lexical verb, interrogative inversion, right? Versus in situ, if you will. Everything stays in its place in English. So, not surprisingly, we look at previous research that has looked at these in heritage language learners, and we find that actually our students, in theory, have trouble producing these VS, verb, subject, word orders. Okay. Is it English influence? Could be, probably a lot of factors. And then particularly in embedded contexts. So it's probably not just a similar typology with one difference, but it's probably also the complexity of the sentence and how that pertains to the processing of an embedded context versus matrix, which is much presumably easier to process. Okay? Less has to be held up there in the memory. So what I used was a very general, very generic lesson plan template, which was developed by Jesse. So it's awesome that he's here. He's going to expand much more on this. But this is I used a template which can really be used to elicit word order judgments of any sort. So we were doing an inversion, adverb placement, but this can be extended to many things. So that's what's exciting about this. We feel that we can keep using this, given that the results are as they are, very, I think, promising. So basically, and we'll have pictures and show you in more detail. But task 1 is a scrambling task, as we've titled it, as he's titled it. But it's really just a variation of a dehydrated sentence task, a typical experimental task. Granted, you could take out some of the smaller elements like prepositions, conjunctions, things like that, articles, and have them add that in to complicate the task. You could leave the verb in the infinitive form, have them conjugate that to add to the complicate, or if you want to test for tenses or things like that, you can do that. But all we're doing is scrambling the words and saying, what's your logical read on this? How would you reword them to produce a canonical form? And so here we have perhaps a response we might expect. Okay. Then, what do? Step 2, also step 2. They switch with a partner. It could be a strategic pair or someone that they're comfortable with. And so there's arguments for working with both. And then you're going to judge, they're going to look at the partner's responses, judgments, I should say, or productions. And you're going to say, was it well-formed, not well-formed, or unsure. Okay. And then finally, step 3, and there's variations of this. You discuss your judgments with your partner, it's paired. And optionally, you can record them doing this, sort of a lab style. Maybe they can listen to themselves, what they said later on. We recorded them for the purposes of transcribing and really thinking about what metalinguistic knowledge was discussed, developed? In what way were they thinking critically so we could analyze it further? And so we could provide you with some information on your handouts. So, some basic research questions that pertain to my study, particularly, or my task, my classroom activity. Do, in fact, heritage learners have trouble acquiring subject-verb inversion? And do heritage language learners resolve word disagreements in paired discussions? But probably, more importantly, and what we're going to focus on here, do heritage languages form and test hypotheses about language, both related and unrelated to the specific linguistic structure? Okay, we're looking at critical thinking, development of metalinguistic knowledge, acceptance of differences. So that's what we're talking about. Okay. Once again, the working hypothesis, if there is disagreement in the paired interaction, then the following discussion will force the student to explain why she believes what she does. This will promote hypothesis formation, testing, and the development of metalinguistic. Okay, so I'm going to move right along because I don't want to take more than just a few more minutes. But just to give you an idea of what we're looking at, I'm going to be recording 2 individual participants. This was done for the whole class. Results varied. This you'll see, I chose this one actually because it's not one of the best examples, so I wanted to show how it's still effective despite not being one of the best. These aren't the real names, so we have Orlando and Alejandro. They're both native speakers in the sense that they grew up with Spanish in the home, speaking with their mother and their father, who are both also L1 Spanish, their parents. They continued to speak in Spanish. Okay, so there's actually, if I'm not mistaken, the oldest sort of in their family, which is they continue speaking Spanish on the phone when they visit. It's still present in the household. So Orlando looks at these scrambled tasks. He puts them in a certain order, and he comes up with VS, suggesting verb subject, suggesting interrogative inversion, as we might expect, or not, if you're following what Prusa and Frank have seen. And then matrix as well. So, no problem. No problem. So far, nothing to really focus on. Alejandro, who's a very advanced speaker, spent his first 5 years actually in Mexico and immigrated here. He had, I wouldn't say trouble, he just interpreted the task. We all know everyone interprets tasks a little differently. So the question is, what can we do with that? He had a little issue with the matrix part. He would say, María, ¿con quién cantó la canción? He would say, Dani, ¿cuándo le echó azúcar al café? And then also he would say, Jorge escuchó la música donde. So in one reading, he would say, this is subject verb, this is subject verb. Why is he doing that? Is it from English? What's going on? But the reality isn't that, and as you'll see in your handout, he sort of misunderstood the task. But that's not going to get in the way of our goal. Okay, so if you'll refer, sorry, how do I go back? If you'll refer to your handout just for a second. Yep, got it. Thanks. If you refer to your handout just for a second, if we look at one discussion, ¿Con quién cantó la canción María? Where we know that, this is just page 1, said María, ¿con quién cantó la canción? I'm just going to read some of the English here, an analysis of what was actually said. So Orlando's explaining why he judged Alejandro's sentence as odd, okay, and offers how he would have written it. Okay. Alejandro confirms this and provides positive feedback. He says that he was thinking this as well. Very early on in the conversation, they're showing good alignment, good communication. These are advanced speakers. Okay. You can see their Spanish above. Alejandro explains that he did not end up responding in a certain way because he was confused. Okay. Only the name Maria is capitalized, and he thinks that means it must start the sentence. Right? So not only does it have to start the sentence, but he's probably thinking of a direct speech as opposed to. So Maria, ¿por qué cantó la canción? Right? I mean, I guess that's if you're using the formal version, you could do that. Orlando jumps at the chance to provide feedback. Okay? He talks about information about content of Alejandro's production. He explains that if there were a pause, a comma, or more context, then maybe then we can start looking at it. But there's not. Okay? So he's touching indirectly on this idea of what does a pause, what does a comma mean? Well, triggering direct speech, intonation, and issues along those lines. Okay? Then in the end, Alejandro is totally in agreement, and he decides, okay, yeah, I misunderstood, I should have done subject verb inversion. Okay? Now, if we'll just look at one more example here, on page 2, one of the more interesting examples, the ¿Dónde escuchó Jorge la música? Or Jorge escuchó la música ¿Dónde? As Alejandro replied. So Orlando questions a lot of things now. Now keep in mind, Alejandro's a more advanced speaker, but they're having some really good dialogue here. Lack of subject verb conversion. Why did you do that? Why was there WH and CT? Okay, as opposed to reason. Things get more interesting still. Okay, Orlando begins to analyze the word order after the verb. Okay? And here there's actually a communication breakdown. Perhaps Orlando now is not used to calling words by their part of speech or their function. He says verb instead of noun, thinks there is a difference between nombre and sustantivo. Okay? Now Abraham can help Orlando. Okay? Which is in what is actually a pretty difficult situation, right? Because nombre is ambiguous here. Does it mean noun? Does it mean the name? Which in this case would be Jorge. So it's a rich discussion. Okay? So Abraham says, are we discussing someone's name or the word noun? It appears that Orlando is trying to say that the subject appears before the object, okay, after the verb, which is actually a preferred order. He just thinks it sounds better. Okay? Then Orlando is looking for confirmation and alignment. Okay, so he says, okay, entonces después del verbo, so estamos de acuerdo, we're in agreement, and yes. So Alejandro says, okay. ¿Dónde escuchó Jorge la música? Yeah, agreement. So they're aligned in the end. So just to summarize, and then I shall step back and introduce Jesse. What do we have here? These are just two examples of two participants. But we have a co-constructed metalinguistic knowledge. Okay, this includes direct versus indirect speech thoughts, interrogative inversion, subject, object, word order, post-verbal, parts of speech, verb, nombre, sustantivo, word functions, subject versus object, and WH movement versus WH and CP. And then they even take it a step beyond that and co-construct hypotheses. Well, direct speech is to speak at somebody, okay, allows pre-verbal subject, but a pause would be required. So that's why this can't really be what we're talking about here. In written form, it would be something like a comma, right? Jesse, ¿qué estás haciendo? Right? Jesse, I should have probably had a bigger break in between those two. Jesse, what are you doing? Oh, okay. And so that's one co-constructed hypothesis. Another one, embedded in matrix WH questions, display obligatory interrogative inversion. They co-constructed that. The subject should come directly after the verb before objects, if any, should be sort of a VSO order. That's what they decided. The WH questions, movement of the WH element is favored over WH and C, which is the canonical form. And these are just some examples of these two participants. So without further ado, let me get out of your way and offer Jesse here.
Okay, so I'm going to kind of continue the discussion that Josh was having on bilingualism and biculturalism in our classrooms. I'm going to talk about a couple of the activities that we piloted last semester, primarily in Josh's class, but then I've also run some of the activities with the upper division Spanish speakers as well. So I'm going to touch on the flipped classroom model, which is, just a sort of a catchy way to say they do their homework at home and then come prepared to class to work. And then the second one, I'll get back to the scrambled activities. So, in the Media Center, we've been developing some grammar tutorials, so we decided to see if the heritage speakers could go home and kind of do some of this instructional piece, the metalinguistic grammar acquisition piece outside of class. And then they go ahead, well, I can take you to the site, but basically I just run them through, develop this little organizer here, and they complete tasks along the way. There's some explanations about the grammar as they go. They can check their answers as they go, and then hopefully they come to class with some pre-knowledge that we can work with. And then in class, Josh had developed an activity where, along with the Spanish and Texas Choral Project, we used their videos. We pulled out videos that had examples of porn product in them, and then they were able to sort of compare what they thought about porn product to how these bilinguals were using porn product, analyze why and why not, see if their intuitions matched what they had come across. And
Pues muchos eran de causa.
and they just discuss, lots of discussion.
O sea, por ser esto lo discriminaban, por hacer lo otro, por no hacer lo otro.
So just good discussions that come out of this. Some of it's in English, some of it's in Spanish. If they can start to do it in Spanish, I think that's probably preferred, but doesn't always happen. But the idea is that they're developing the metalinguistic awareness as they go through these activities, and then challenging it based on corpus and.
Pues,
I know chalkboard, I do draw like a no speaking English sign, and I with blood coming down. So preferably no English.
Do this. And so this is just some graphics of the same kind of activity that Josh was talking about here with the word order stuff. So again, they work in pairs of two. They have different tasks. Student A has a similar but different sentence than student B. So then when they come together, they have a different set of sentences that they're critiquing when they analyze their production. But then they can also start to think, oh wait, those were similar to my sentences, I did them a little bit differently, they can see it from a different angle, and then it seems to inspire some good conversation when they get together and then start the discussion process. And we record the discussions, we transcribe them, they can also analyze their own discussions, but just a little bit of information on a few of the discussions between some of the heritage speakers. These were two sets of heritage speakers from upper division courses. Just a little bit of background information, as Josh talked about. We can really look. There were interesting group trends, but also really interesting individual trends. And these individual differences can inspire a lot of hypothesizing, hypothesis testing. So we have a female and a male speaker here. Both be identified as heritage speakers as they grew up with some Spanish in the household. Learned Spanish from birth, one from Houston, one from Eagle Pass. Their self-rated proficiency, just quickly, was one. She rated herself a 4, him a 3.5, based on reading, writing, speaking, and listening. Their amount of Spanish at home, 0 to 4, so she notes having mostly Spanish in the household, where he notes having some Spanish in the household. So we already start to see where individual differences in our heritage learner groups already would come to play. And then how long have they spent? She just said she has spent some time in Mexico, but didn't say how long. He hasn't spent any time in a Spanish-speaking country. And then if we look at, for example, their use, where they place like manner-type adverbs, like suavemente, cuidadosamente, fácilmente. If we're going to look in English, the canonical word order would be something like Maria found the building easily, or Maria easily found the building. So either pre-verbally or potentially at the end of the phrase. Where in Spanish, you can get this interruption between the verb and the object. So you could say something like, Maria found easily the building, which maybe in some like conversational English you might hear, but it's not supposed to be the canonical structure in English. So they have some differences in their placements, and so then they discuss, and they have these great conversations. But it's really interesting to see about how they go about this process of how do you critique sort of the other person's speech. You're both probably have had some issues in your life with being critiqued about your language. So these can be really sensitive topics and things that I think that we preface in the beginning of Josh's course, like what does it mean to be a heritage speaker? How do you value yourself in this context? But it still gets, you see a lot of stuttering, well, in my opinion, a lot of couching this in different ways. But a lot of times what's neat is that they come to the conclusion that we're both right. I didn't really think about it the way you had said it, but that does sound right. And I think both of these sound good. Maybe just one sounds a little bit better, or then they start to think about contexts in which maybe you could actually say that. And this is the kind of hypothesis testing and metalinguistic development that I think is really crucial for these kind of courses. And just a couple more examples. In the green is sort of the resolving differences issue, and then the yellow I have like where they start to develop the meta-linguistic awareness. Well, we have more examples. So with here in the meta-linguistic awareness, they start to bring in words like adverb and noun, and you can see that they really aren't sure about how to use these words. This is not part of their vernacular, which we would expect if you haven't gone to school and thought about these literary type of prescriptive rules placed on language. So it gives them a chance to think about these things, and then it also gives us insight into like what they're thinking about these things. It can inform our instruction. So just some anecdotes about what they think about adverbs, where adverbs go in sentences. We collected a little bit of data. I'm not sure. I think I know, but I can't decide. They go anywhere. Maybe a little bit of meta-linguistic knowledge here, displayed better when placed directly after the verb. And talking about in Spanish, okay? Not much. I guess I have an instinct. They're weird. They go next to verbs or complements, but usually end in mente, but also ayer is one. So they're kind of just not precise, and then we can help develop this, and then the development of this meta-linguistic awareness, comparing to corpus, can then give them the power to decide, maybe if they want to, in different conversations or formal or informal contexts, then which language would they like to use. Just more resources. So getting back to the development of meta-linguistic awareness, like I said here, they start to talk about, she says, like, those adverbios. I mean, para hacer ponerlos antes de, no sé, los adverbios son una parte de la oración, so those adverbs, I mean, like, to put them before, I don't know, adverbs are like part of the sentence, do you get me? Just, they're struggling, but this is good, like, this is hypothesis building around these issues. Another group here, this CH, she was born in Monterrey. She lived there for 10 years, but then moved to the U.S. and began her education here in the U.S. at age 10 in English. All of her education was in English, except for a couple of Spanish courses she had taken here at UT. Self-rated proficiency 4, Spanish at home 4. Okay, this MA, she was female, a little bit younger, born in San Diego, California. Fairly high self-rated proficiency, a lot of Spanish at home. Barely spent any time out of the country, just a vacation to El Salvador for a month once. Again, we see a big difference in she placed all of the adverbs between the verb and the object. She only placed one of the adverbs between the verb and the object, and everything else was at the end of the sentence. So again, we kind of see these conversations happening. She starts critiquing here, and she says, Julia está apenas, she's barely finishing the exam. She thinks it maybe sounds better if you put apenas in front of estar, so they're going back and forth, and then she critiques another one down here where she says, bad should go after, writing the list bad instead of writing bad the list. Okay, then she's kind of like, oh wait, okay, which ones were you critiquing? Because I'm pretty confident that my language is correct, so let's go back and analyze this. She says, so then they get into this nice conversation, and then she starts to pull out her knowledge of metalinguistics to try to explain why she thinks she's right, why she said the things she said, and we just really appreciate these conversations. So here she says, okay, normally in Spanish, like I know from birth, de primero, the subject and then the verb. Okay, but never mind, that's irrelevant to what we have here. Oh, actually, with the Julia está. So she's thinking the subject, then the verb, and then something else can go. But, you know, that's the stuff, that's why I put it there. What's she doing? Then she questions, let me think about it again. Here, está apenas caminando, so she's doing, okay, let's think about it. But I put the verb there because it would be like a little incorrect. See all these like un tanto, like a little bit incorrect to say this, and that's okay, but in my opinion, right, like all these pragmatic couches here, and then she says, okay, maybe it could be that way. I think they're both correct. And then they come to this conclusion that maybe both are acceptable. And I think that's the direction we like them to go, is that they're different but acceptable in most cases. Another example, and then we have the reverse thing. Oh, they just keep coming back to this, yeah, but they're both fine. Yeah, but it could be vice versa. And maybe she says, oh, I never thought about there being multiple options. And so it starts to also raise their awareness of language having multiple potential outcomes, depending on context, etc. So the development of meta, so we talked a little bit about, she starts talking about the subject in verb order. Here she talks about, por ejemplo, yo le pondría, I would put it here because it's describing, the adverb is describing the verb. So she's not using precise metalinguistic terminology, but she is just giving a nice description of what is actually happening, like what is the function of an adverb and how am I thinking about it, especially since in English and Spanish, the positions can often be different. And then one more development metalinguistics here we have, nada más porque como, por ejemplo, again, just nothing but, for example, it's like describing, the adverb is describing the verb, therefore, por eso, I thought that maybe it could go, pudiera, nice subjunctive here, maybe it could go in this place, but also before. Oh, sí. So, and then a nice follow-up is to potentially have the learners, so you can, they've exposed each other to the differences and the variation between each other. You can bring in results from corpus, so you can have them look at data that exists in monolingual Spanish-speaking data. You can have them look at, like we did with the Spanish and Texas corpus, bilingual data. So here I could show them that these were the results from their activity. They had quite a variety of pre- and post-object adverb placement, whereas in the corpus, adverb post-object placement was really relegated to the mente verbs, or the mente adverbs, like cuidados, carefully, easily, quickly, and smoothly, where these other adverbs were hard to find in post-object position. It doesn't mean it's not possible, it's just the trend suggests something different. This may suggest a certain bilingual grammar. It doesn't mean that you have to emulate this, but knowledge is power, I think, is kind of our point. We can look at it from a statistical perspective, where we can see that the learner results are statistically different than the corpus results, but again, we don't have to prescribe that the corpus is the way to go, but just to awareness. And then also we can look at what they're doing, and it seems if we factor, for example, weight, like syllables, it seems that maybe they're relying on syllable count or heaviness of an adverb, and that's determining where it's going. So all the heavy adverbs are just putting an end of the sentence to align more with something you would say in English, but something that's lighter, they're interpolating between the verb and the object. And maybe that's different than a monolingual would do it. Maybe it's different than an educated bilingual would do it. We don't know. But I mean, by comparing the corpus, we can kind of uncover some of these trends. And this is also, we know this trend is the same with our advanced second language learners as well, which is also kind of interesting. So that's what I have, and we'll pass it to fabulous and entertaining video.
Thank you for the introduction. Okay. Well, this activity, I'm going to present an activity that we've been working on with different people in Spanish department. It's an activity that came from conversations with Dr. Salisbury, Belén Vecinos, Josh, Desi, and other bilingual instructors as we're trying to redesign the program for bilinguals. And so my objectives, based from these conversations, were to move away from lexical activities that promoted vocabulary lists, memorization, and replacing students' knowledge of language with what is considered standard. And allow time for students to reflect on the nature of language through a specific example related to lexical variation. And finally, to help students become conscious of the power that language has to create knowledge, to communicate information, and also manipulate social situations. Because in many cases in these bilingual classrooms, these students feel like, because their Spanish is not good enough, they just don't feel comfortable enough speaking it, so then they refer back to the English. So with these objectives in mind, I designed an activity that had 4 parts. First part had the language use and awareness, the cultural context. I thought cultural text, it's a comic from a Mexican cartoonist called Trino. And then the second part had to do with language performance, which was a video de teatro or a skit. And then the third part had to do with reflective judgment, where the students had to reflect about creating the skit and what the language they used would make you feel. And then the last part had to do with language production, in which they assess or comment or critique a dictionary definition so as to challenge the status quo of what is considered normative standard definitions. The implementation was 60 minutes. Students had 15 minutes for each section. They worked individually on all sections except for the skit. And after each section, students volunteered to share the responses with the rest of the class. And then at the end, the activity was turned in. The first part, language use and awareness, we have this comic, which I don't know if all of you can see, but it's basically about robbers and this robber comes into his bag, and there's a misunderstanding with the word coquette. Because he says, es un asalto, lo siento tío, no tengo peleas. Yo, tío, escúchame. Tengo cara de tío, gambón, entrégame todo el dinero. Joder, ¿qué no ves que estoy hecho de patatas con este ordenador? ¿Ordena? Pues yo como ordenador, y ahora tengo que me entregue la lana. Ostras, tío, no seas cagarotas, coge y lárgate, ya. Bueno, a ninguna se lo he negado nunca, y tan directa, órale. Then the police come and bring it up. So basically, there's several misunderstandings here. The first one is that he thinks, and he's like, tío, that means uncle, what's going on? And then ordenador, he's like, what do you mean to organize? And then lazo, coger, which I'm part of my English language, means fuck, in a very informal, in Latin America specifically. He was very confused because he thinks that's what she's saying, but he's saying, like, take your stuff and leave. So there's a confusion there. So then the students were asked the following questions. You have the Spanish version on your handout if you want to refer to it. So I asked them, there's several misunderstandings with this comic, and that was two. Most students were able to do that. Then the police tells the robber that cocaine is not the same in Spain as than there. What places do you think they're referring to by using the word there? What does the word cocaine mean to you? What are some synonyms of this word? Why do you think there are different meanings to the word cocaine? And at the end of the comic, the robber says that the secretary's use of cocaine is similar to his use. Why do you think he says this? Do you agree to his observation? And you basically have to explain your answer. And the outcome, students were able to identify the main misunderstanding that derives from the word cocaine. Most were unaware that it was popularly used in Spain with the meanings of to grab or to take. However, ironically, for all 23 students, the word cocaine had a sexual meaning. Yet when asked for synonyms, they produced the meanings like agarrar, tomar, escoger, cocaine, seleccionar. So it was kind of a paradox there. The questions that, so let's do some students categorize cocaine as a product of evolution of language. Some students of Mexican heritage refer to it as an albur. When asked by other non-Mexican heritage students what it meant, one explained that it is a pun or a word with double meaning, which in turn produced a discussion of other words like chile, papaya, panocha, concha, fumar, etc. I was not expecting this. That was kind of the result of the activity, which is great because that's what you want them to do, engage in your language learning and your culture production. So the second part had to do with the skit. I had to prepare a short skit with a couple of the classmates that picked the cultural situation in which there was a misunderstanding due to the use of the word coquette, or because of our vivid, candid conversation, they could use any word that had a meaning. Then they had to decide who was going to use a word with Spanish meaning and who was going to use it with Latin American meaning, choose a setting, and then write a brief outline of the skit and practice it a little bit, and then they had to present to the rest of the classroom. So, students were able to be creative not only about the use of coquette, but also about words like fumar and pan. This is one of the skits.
Oh, que estamos en una oficina. Y estos son osos. ¿Ok?
Like tigers.
Ajá. Estamos haciendo, que vamos a hacer un experimento, ¿verdad? Para que escojan los osos que les gustan de niñas.
Sí, los más fuertes.
Sí, vamos a traer la siguiente niña. Hola, buenas tardes, ¿cómo estás, mija? Ok, mija, este experimento es para que cojas un oso que te guste más.
¿Quieres que loco?
Sí, coge el oso que te guste más, el que esté más suave.
¿Qué tipo de experimento es?
No, es un malentendido. Nosotros quieren que agarras lo que quieres.
Oh,
Lo que te gusta
okay.
Okay, so after they did this, they had to think about it. They were asked what was the hardest part of making the skit, which skit do you like the most, and explain why. If you were to find yourself in a situation where there was a misunderstanding, how sort of difference in meaning, and use of the word coquette, how would you improvise to mediate the situation? So they went from like fun that's acted out to really thinking about what it meant to them. Some students said that the hardest thing about creating the skits and parodies was being embarrassed, not because it didn't know what the parody meant, but because it didn't understand how to use it, how to make it a double meaning, a group in a way. And most mentioned that if they found themselves in a situation where there was a misunderstanding about lexical variations, they would simply explain the difference, or in their own words. I would provide as an explanation of the lexical variations in different countries, so they're already using this vocabulary that we're giving them. If I understand what they're referring to, I don't think I would correct them, because each culture has their own way of speaking. But if I feel confused, then I would definitely just ask what they were referring to so I can clear my doubts and learn something new. And finally, I would explain that the word "cohered" has two meanings, and I would tell them in which meaning you can use which meaning. Then the last part had to do with questioning this definition. I took this from Guías para sobre reglas de uso y estilo by Samuel Cohen, and basically in this definition, Cohen is saying that, cohered has 32 definitions, and just because one is sexual, we shouldn't stop using it. And he basically points out that the 31st definition, meaning that it's a vulgar expression in America, it means to have sex. And this, of course, kind of got him thinking, and at the end he said we have to lose the fear of using the word just because one of them has a sexual meaning. The students, when they were reflecting upon it, most of them agreed that with Cohen's definition, he supported the varieties of cohered according to the context. There were a few that, like the rest, reflected on the use of language, but also focused on the political implications of language, and those are the ones I want to show you today. First student said, Samuel Cohen said that we should lose fear to the words and learn to use them well. But who is an owner of languages, and who's to say what is right, or what definition is true? I'm not in agreement that there's only one definition for every word that we use. Language identifies a person to distinguish other cultures or countries. I am in agreement that we're not obligated to use it in that way if we don't want to, but each person has the right to choose how they want to talk and what definition they want to use for the word. We are free to do what we want. So we went from a very basic, this is a word, this is the definition of the word, to really critical thinking here. I mean, they're thinking about the power of language and who controls it. Then the second student said, I have an opinion that it's varied. I think that all the forms of Spanish need to be recognized, but at the same time, how can we recognize all forms of Spanish without creating characters? I'm agreeing with Cohen because we're not obligated to use all words in this way. It's our choice. But while Cohen expresses his opinion, he also devaluated the use of the word. So again, we see them criticizing what is considered standard, while at the same time being critical about their own understanding of language. And finally, a more simple response. Student 3 said, no, because the dictionary doesn't say, not just because the dictionary says something, a word still has to have varied meanings, especially culturally and different contexts. So my observations after implementing this activity in the classroom were that students learned different directions. We had jokes, they had other questionable words and different meanings. They related personal experiences to examples. So for example, we were talking about, one of our students said, oh, that makes so much sense, because one time when I was at my uncle's house, my uncle told my mom about some Chile, and they all started laughing. I didn't understand what that meant. And so it was like he was finally relating things to his past. They have political implications of the language, and of course, identity politics, which is pretty big for these students. It's important to embrace students and contributions to the activity and allow them to bring time to reflect on their classroom observation. I think as a heritage language instructor, that's one of the most important things to do, especially because in those reflective times, that's when they really get thinking about how they're using it and why they're producing it. Some after thoughts. Well, this activity allows students to flirt with the dirty parts of Spanish because it brings out the peak gap in all of us. It can lead to more hybrid discussions that guide students to become aware of the power the language has to create knowledge, communicate, and represent cultural paradigms, as well as interact with others. That is it. I hope you enjoyed this presentation.
With thanks to all three, there's some fun.
When you're doing the formation, do you discard the Caribbean way of speaking? Because, as we're trying to get that form, I would say it would be better to include and say, and this is another form, so that they wouldn't think this is the only structure, but that they would realize that the language is very diverse, because we have a huge population
Absolutely.
that uses that. So I don't think I would limit them to just thinking this is the only structure, but would bring in both at the same time.
Yeah, I agree, Tyler. Maybe as a follow-up, right after they do this.
Yeah, exactly, so
and
incorporate,
talk
yeah.
about the dialectal variation.
Right, right.
I agree, for sure.
What else? Please, yes.
Let's see, so you've talked about grammatical and lexical differences. One of the things that's most readily noticed is differences in pronunciation. Is that something that you address at all? And I raise it because I'm teaching the Fonética Práctica class right now, and we're on the section on dialect variation. And I would ask, have you ever heard these, or would you produce these? Y lo niegan. I mean, they say that no, they don't produce them, they don't, I mean, they seem to be very normative. I think that they expect, that I expect a particular type of pronunciation, so I'm wondering how you deal with variation.
Could you give us a specific example? Do you mean sort of S-dropping?
S-dropping is a very good example.
Yes, in my classroom, they definitely, when they first come in, they actually approach us like, well, you're not teaching us the standard. Like, I came here to perfect my Spanish, but you're not teaching us that. And I'm like, well, I'm teaching you how to think about it, so you can manipulate your language according to different situations. And then I give them examples. Like, for example, when I go back to Mexico, I become a fresa. Do you know how fresa speak? And I start speaking like a fresa, right? And I was like, because if I speak like I do here with my Latin friends, people down there are not going to understand me, not to mention they're going to question my Mexicanness. So you really have to learn to manipulate that. And once they understand what that means, they start playing around with it. So we have an activity where they have, they're from different countries, and they have to learn how those countries, the particular lexical and like pronunciation issues of each country, right? And when they get together to debate about language, and they have to, when I'm walking around and telling them, like, you know, I'm going to watch it, you see use vos, you drop your S, you pronounce the R, because those are things from these countries. And so they really try to act it out, and it's funny to see how they really try to manipulate their own pronunciation to what I'm looking for. But then if we're not in class time, they will speak freely and won't do anything. So.
In relation to that question, I'm curious, especially given the meta-linguistic emphasis in these classrooms, do you not get discussions of that there is a hierarchy of things as simple, I shouldn't say simple, but as basic as pronunciation that is hierarchical? That is, there's to say amarillo versus amarillo, which is preferred over the other? Is there, does discussion ever lead to, well, my variant is better than your variant because I say amarillo than amarillo?
When I first started teaching in 2000,
Something.
something I can't remember, but I did have that class. But I learned at the beginning of the course, I do an introduction where I say, you know, all of our Spanishes are equal. We all speak different kinds of Spanish, so there's not going to be any of this mine is better than yours or parity. And I do point out, there are those things in Latin America or in Spain, people are going to criticize, but we can learn how to manipulate that so as to gain them over and say, oh, okay, well, his Spanish is cool, you know, or whatever. And I think empowering them that way, as opposed to, as Dr. Solebri says, preaching to them, is much better.
Anyone else?
Can I ask another question?
Please follow up.
On the interrogatives, I'm wondering whether you looked at all at the prosody, right? Because you can have a topic-focused type instruction. So, María, ¿con quién? María y Marco, ¿con quién vinieron ovejas?
Right, and one thing that we've been playing with, especially recently, is in Paso Uno, when you're doing this dehydrated sentence test, to have a little bit of a preamble beforehand, to where the subject of the topic has already been introduced, so you wouldn't want to.
Well, and also for that same purpose, with that specific task, with that specific issue in mind, Josh had them read the sentences declaratively for
I did. This was all recorded, and we did listen afterwards, and
so he could tell later if they were.
But still, the point is well taken. We want to add context to it and make it more natural.
The context is, I tried a contextualization of the adverb project, and it was messy because I used corpus data, and then it was too literary, and then they were lost in the sentences, but yeah, I mean, I like, maybe like moving it to like a preamble, but we also want these activities to not take 2 hours, something, you know, so we're just but we are trying to tweak them to get at these issues because they are important.
I just want to make some comments because I've seen what media is doing with it, and working with media and listening to I have come to change the way I would teach my bilingual students. Because I know that they come in with what you said. I want you to teach us the correct Spanish. And I find it's easier to teach the correct Spanish. It's much more difficult to have them value or notice the power of language. And now, working with them, I've seen that I have been wrong a great deal. And and that there's this huge wealth in these bilingual students where we won't be prescriptive anymore, but we're going to go from the example and have them have a self-worth in their language, and then learn to, when do I want to use this type of Spanish, and with whom do I want to use this type of Spanish. And I know one thing I do want to teach them, and I will tell my students, but I don't when I have other students come see me, is I'm older than you are, much older. No me hables de tú. Okay? So there are certain things I want them to learn how they can use it. Like I can tell them, well, at home you can talk to your grandmother tú, which they probably won't because it's still very ingrained in us. Abuelita es usted. Okay? But for them to understand the power of language, which Lydia was getting to, what I really like about that, and that now they can use this language as they want within the context, but they have the different varieties that they can draw from. So yeah, but she's made me, and Rafael also, that sort of made me understand that. First, before I was very, esto es bastante.
I think like that psychologically, a lot of judgment comes from not having self-compassion, right? So we project that on. So that is a huge.
And I changed my perspective as well. I mean, I started, my dissertation was on empathy and neuroscience, and through all my studies, I realized, being prescriptive is not the best way of teaching students Spanish. I think if you make them reflect on the judgment that they're putting on it, and really empathize with their Spanish, the Spanish of their parents, Spanish that they think is correct, there's a lot more knowledge to be drawn out there than being prescriptive.
It's quite an insight, actually. So, especially given the population we have at the University of Texas, a majority Hispanophone population of Mexicanos. And I still remember back in my college days of taking what was, we didn't have the word heritage course, and it was Spanish for people who had some Spanish. However you had it, and being told from the beginning when it was introduce yourself, and it was me llamo Tomás Jesús Garza. And it was, ¿cómo? Tomás Jesús Garza. And they said, Señor Garza. And it was immediate that I had become Señor Garza. And when I learned to be Garza, and when I went home to my mother, I said, we've been saying it wrong. I said, our name isn't Garza. I said, our name is not that. My mother couldn't recall it. I said, under no circumstances. So it's an interesting perspective. I think this is brought up. We did this in teaching Russian. There are Russians that we have to deal with, whether you're coming in from Ukraine or whether you're from the homeland or from Brighton Beach in Brooklyn, and so that we have to deal with different levels of Frenches, Russians, and Spanishes that this kind of meta-linguistic conversation seems to raise in our classrooms. It's a terrific conversation for us to have, and a really good job that you all are doing in the classroom. Yeah. So I think, yes, with my babbling on, I think I've gone over it. Could I please bother you all, before we thank our panelists one last time, to fill out one of those forms that Betsy's pointing to them, like Hannah White at the back. So our little evaluation forms, and to once again thank our panelists for a wonderful presentation.